Before this story continues, please allow me to be clear about one thing. The story you are about to hear is a fictional narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes, intended to reflect toxic family conflicts and the inner journey of a woman who endured silence for far too long. All characters, events, and circumstances are entirely fictional and are not based on any real individuals or real situations. This content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told to evoke empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been hurt within their own families. All content is designed to be advertiser-friendly and compliant with YouTube community policies, and it is not intended to misrepresent, attack, or imply any real person. If you recognize a part of your own life in this story, stay until the end, and if something inside you is stirred, share your thoughts in the comments, or follow the channel to continue alongside stories created for women who have carried quiet burdens and still deserve to be understood and respected. My name is Emily Bennett. I am 27 years old, and I work as a compliance analyst. It is not a glamorous job. It does not come with power or applause. It comes with procedures, timelines, and a habit of noticing what does not belong. I live carefully. I save more than I spend. I write things down because memory alone is unreliable. I do not need to be loved. I only need to be treated with respect. My mother, Laura Bennett, spent most of her life in asset management and real estate. She believed in preparation, structure, and quiet control. She did not trust chaos, and she did not trust anyone who rushed decisions involving money. When she married Richard Hale, my stepfather, she believed she had found stability. Richard was always polite, always measured, always the kind of man who spoke softly and smiled at the right moments. He liked to say things like, "Let the adults handle it," especially when the subject involved money. My Aunt Maggie Collins, my mother's sister, was different. She did not like unnecessary conversation. She had worked for years as a paralegal and office manager, and she understood documents better than people. She avoided family drama, not because she was afraid of it, but because she did not tolerate dishonesty. The day my mother was buried was in April of 2023 at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The air smelled like lilies and damp grass. People shook hands and repeated the same gentle phrases they always do at funerals. "I am so sorry for your loss. She was a wonderful woman. If you need anything, let us know." Richard stood near the front, accepting condolences like a man performing a familiar role. His suit was pressed, his voice was calm. His grief looked practiced. Maggie did not cry. She did not hug me. Instead, she waited until I stepped away from the group and then took my arm, guiding me toward the side of the cemetery where the noise softened. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear her and whispered, "Do not show this to your stepdad." She placed a thin stack of papers into my hand, stapled together with a few printed emails folded inside. Before I could ask her anything, Richard appeared beside us. He smiled the way people do when they want to seem harmless, and said, "Family meetings are exhausting, aren't they?" His hand rested on my shoulder a moment longer than necessary. It was not affectionate. It was controlling. I glanced down at the papers Maggie had given me, and my eyes caught a single line near the bottom of the first page. A notary acknowledgement date. March 2023. The same week my mother was in hospice care, heavily medicated, barely able to finish a sentence. The shock hit before the grief had time to settle. In that moment, I learned something that people over 50 already understand. Paperwork does not betray you. People do. And if you have ever been told not to worry about money, keep listening, because the truth always hides in the smallest details. Richard did not wait long to assert control. That same afternoon, as the last guests began to leave, he leaned toward me and said, "Your mom did not want you dealing with financial stress." It sounded caring. It was not. A family friend standing nearby nodded and added, "Emily has always been sensitive." I said nothing. I watched. I swallowed what rose in my throat and focused on breathing. Maggie avoided Richard's eyes. The words trust, amendment, and beneficiary floated through conversations around me without explanation, like everyone already understood something I did not. Before the day ended, I paid for the remaining funeral expenses with my own card. I did not ask. I did not announce it. Richard noticed. His expression changed for half a second, just long enough for me to see it. If you have ever been silenced inside your own family, tell me honestly. Did you stay quiet too? Emily speaking. After the funeral ended and the last of the chairs were folded away, I did not go home. I followed Richard to the brownstone he shared with my mother, and sat at the dining table where I had spent holidays pretending we were closer than we were. The silence that evening felt rehearsed. It gave him room to move. While I stared at the grain of the wood, he began explaining things the way he always did when he wanted control to sound like care. He reminded me that my mother had been cautious with money and that she believed in structure. He said this as if he were reading from a manual only he possessed. He told me that back in 2014 she had set up a trust to reduce risk and simplify decisions, and that over the years she had refined it as her assets grew. He said she asked him to oversee the details because he had time and because he loved her. He said love makes people careful. In those years between 2014 and 2019, he volunteered himself into the center of every decision. I remember the first time I noticed it. I had asked a question about a rental property she owned in Queens, and he answered before she could. He smiled and said, "I am protecting you." At the time, it sounded harmless. Over time, it became a pattern. Emails about finances stopped, including my name. Shared folders disappeared from my access. I did not have logins to accounts that held my future. I did not even know the name of the CPA handling the trust. When I asked my mother, she would squeeze my hand and say, "Richard has it covered." When I asked Richard, he would repeat, "I am protecting you." Protection felt a lot like exclusion. After the funeral, he moved quickly. Within days, he announced a family dinner to remember Laura. He said it would help us heal. The table was set formally. Candles lit. Her favorite dish served. Then he slid a folder to the center and began talking about the trust as if grief had a schedule. He spoke calmly about amendments and stewardship and timelines. He said things were already in motion, and that this was not the time for confusion. A family friend nodded along. Another relative commented on how hard Richard had been working. I listened as my role was summarized without me being asked. Beneficiary, not decision maker. I tried to ask a simple question about what had changed recently, and he answered with a smile that never reached his eyes. He said, "This is technical." He said, "Your mom trusted me." Then came the moment that made the room tilt. Someone said, "Emily, you do not even own a home. You would not understand asset management." It was said lightly, almost kindly, like advice. I felt heat climb my neck, but I did not speak. Inside my head, the sentence repeated, "I do not lack understanding. I lack permission." I thought of the years I had spent working through compliance issues where details mattered and assumptions cost money. I thought of the notes I kept and the habits I built because systems fail when people are sloppy. None of that mattered in that room. What mattered was who held the folder. Richard closed the conversation by saying there had been an amendment and that everything was being handled. He said it like a period at the end of a sentence. Later that week, he asked me to come by his office to acknowledge receipt of documents. The phrase sounded harmless. Acknowledgement of receipt. A piece of paper that simply confirmed I had been informed. He said it was standard. He said it would help keep things smooth. I read it slowly. It stated that I had received notice of changes. Not that I agreed, not that I understood, just that I had been told. I asked what the changes were, and he replied with the same measured tone. "Nothing you need to worry about. This is to keep the peace." I did not sign. He did not argue. He leaned back and said, "We can revisit when emotions settle." That night I made a call. I did not announce it. I did not explain it. I said only, I made a call on Monday when he asked where I had been. He raised an eyebrow and moved on. Over the next few days, he continued as if the amendment were already done. He referred to it in passing. He spoke about managing properties and consolidating accounts. Each reference felt like a door closing. Each polite sentence tightened the room around me. He began to CC me on emails that said nothing and exclude me from emails that mattered. When I asked for documents, he sent summaries. When I asked for names, he sent assurances. The environment was not loud or cruel. It was efficient. It was clean. It was designed to make resistance look unreasonable. I could feel the escalation even when nothing overt happened. Control by courtesy. Authority by paperwork. I watched how people responded to him, how they deferred, how my silence was interpreted as agreement. Maggie noticed too. She did not say much, but she would look at me across the table and then back at Richard with a tight mouth. When he mentioned the amendment again, she cleared her throat and asked when it had been drafted. He answered quickly and changed the subject. The dinner ended with leftovers boxed and candles blown out. As I stood to leave, he placed the acknowledgement form in front of me again and said it would help everyone move forward. He spoke softly. He used my name. He made it sound like a favor. I thought about how often peace is purchased by those who have the least power. I folded the paper and put it in my bag. I did not sign it. If you were in my place, would you sign it just to keep the peace, be honest? I did not open the envelope at the cemetery. I did not open it in the car. I carried it home like something fragile, and waited until the apartment was quiet enough to hear my own thoughts. My place in Queens is small and ordinary. A narrow kitchen with a single overhead light that hums when it warms up, a refrigerator that clicks on and off at irregular intervals. That night those sounds felt louder than usual. I placed the envelope on the counter and washed my hands, even though they were already clean. When I finally opened it, my fingers trembled in a way that surprised me. Inside was a draft trust amendment dated March 2023. Not a final copy, not notarized, but complete enough to show intent. Beneath it were printed emails folded twice and a single yellow note written in Maggie's hand. Your mom was not lucid that week. I read the amendment slowly. It proposed a shift in control rather than ownership. That distinction mattered more than most people realize. Ownership sounds like power, but control is what decides outcomes. The document named Richard as successor trustee with expanded authority. It referenced efficiency and continuity. It did not mention me beyond acknowledging my status as beneficiary. The date caught my eye again. March 2023. The week my mother was moved into hospice care, the week she struggled to keep her eyes open long enough to finish a sentence. I moved to the emails next. They were exchanges between Richard and an office address that included the words legal and notary. The subject lines were calm and procedural, re-execution options, witness availability, scheduling considerations. The tone was polite and efficient, no emotion, no urgency, just steps. I felt a tightening in my chest as I read a line asking whether remote witnessing would suffice given the client condition. Another email mentioned limited windows of clarity. I set the papers down and leaned against the counter. The refrigerator clicked on. I thought about my mother trying to follow a conversation while medicated and exhausted. I thought about how easy it would be to nod along just to make something stop. That was when my phone buzzed, a text from Richard. Please do not involve Maggie. She is emotional. The message arrived like a hand on my shoulder again, polite, smiling, warning. I did not respond. I placed the phone face down and returned to the papers. I began to build a timeline the way I do at work when something does not add up. I wrote dates on a legal pad: hospital admission, medication changes, hospice intake, the email timestamps, the draft date. Patterns emerged that did not require imagination to see. There was no final capacity assessment attached, no independent witness statement, just references to availability. The yellow note from Maggie sat off to the side like a quiet witness. I took photos of everything with my phone, front and back. I created a folder and named it by date and subject. I saved copies to a cloud drive and to a local folder on my laptop. I labeled each file clearly. Amendment Draft March, Email Chain Notary, Notes Maggie. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. Control is lost when records are sloppy. I was not sloppy. As I worked, I noticed something else. One email mentioned successor trustee authority in a way that implied decisions could be made without beneficiary input. That distinction between control and ownership is where people lose everything while being told they still have something. I knew enough to recognize the risk. If Richard had control, he could move assets, restructure holdings, and limit access while insisting nothing had been taken. The danger was not a single act. It was time. I finished organizing and sat at the table staring at the pad. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Richard asking if I had questions. I did not answer. Instead, I wrote down every instance I could remember when my mother had deferred to him out of exhaustion. Every appointment she asked me to handle, and he stepped in instead. Every time he answered for her. I realized then that this was not confusion. It was a plan built quietly over months. I closed my laptop and listened to the refrigerator hum. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, focus. This was not about confronting him or proving intent with words. This was about evidence and process, about showing that what looked efficient was actually improper. I went to bed late and slept lightly. The next morning there was another message waiting. Richard asked if I had received the documents. I replied that I had. Nothing more. An hour later, Maggie called and left a voicemail saying, "Only be careful. He knows I gave you something." That confirmed what I already suspected. Someone was watching movement. Someone noticed a change in behavior. I added a note to my timeline. Richard aware of Maggie contact. I returned to the emails and read them again. One phrase stood out. Limited witness availability. It was not proof, but it was a thread. I pulled it gently. I did not need to jump ahead. I needed to understand exactly how control had been positioned to shift. I began researching the difference between temporary authority and permanent control within a trust structure like my mother's. The language was technical but familiar. Successor trustee clauses, powers granted upon incapacity, triggers for activation. Each paragraph I read made the risk clearer. If the amendment stood unchallenged, the outcome would not be immediate loss. It would be quiet erosion. Decisions made without me, information filtered, doors closing one by one while being told everything was fine. I felt the weight of that realization settle. This was the frightening part. Not that something had already been taken, but that it could be, and that I was expected to accept it politely. My phone buzzed again. A short message this time. Let us keep this within the family. I did not reply. I saved the message and added it to the folder. If someone smiles while warning you, that is not love. That is control. You would feel that too, right? Richard scheduled the meeting like he was doing me a favor. His text was short and tidy. Let us clear up the technical details. He included an address in Manhattan and a time that fell right in the middle of a workday, as if my life was a flexible thing he could fold and set aside. When I arrived, the building lobby smelled like polished stone and expensive air freshener. The security desk asked for my name and then called upstairs. I waited under bright lights that made everyone look slightly tired. I reminded myself to breathe slowly. I was not there to win an argument. I was there to watch how they tried to frame the story. The office was quiet in that way. Professional places are quiet, like the walls had been trained to absorb stress. Richard stood when I entered. He smiled with the practiced softness he used in public. He did not hug me. He did not ask how I was sleeping. He gestured to a chair and introduced two people as if we were at a dinner party. A legal assistant sat near the end of the table with a folder already open. A financial advisor in a tailored suit placed a pen beside a notepad, ready to look concerned at the correct moments. No one asked me what I knew. They assumed they would tell me. Richard began with his calm voice. This is technical. He said it the way some men say sweetie, as if the word itself should shrink you. He added, your mom trusted me, then let that sentence hang in the air like a verdict. The financial advisor nodded, once slow and sympathetic, as if I were a difficult patient. The assistant slid a page toward me with a subtle push, like feeding paper into a machine. Richard explained that the trust was designed to protect assets and minimize stress for the family. He used words like continuity and stability. He avoided words like control and access. I listened without interrupting. When I did speak, my voice stayed even. I asked what changes had been made since March 2023. Richard's smile tightened slightly. The advisor answered instead, explaining how these documents work, how beneficiaries receive benefits, but do not need to manage the structure. He said it like it was common sense. In other words, I was a beneficiary, and I did not need to know the details. Richard leaned back and clasped his hands. We are trying to keep you from making emotional decisions. The sentence was almost gentle. That was the problem. It sounded like care. It was not. It was an accusation disguised as concern. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not because I was embarrassed, but because I recognized the tactic. If I reacted strongly, they would call me unstable. If I stayed quiet, they would call me cooperative. Either way, they would keep the steering wheel. Richard continued explaining that Maggie had been upset at the funeral and that grief makes people irrational. He said her name with the kind of patience people reserve for toddlers who are about to spill juice on a carpet. He suggested that I avoid listening to her because she was emotional. The advisor added that family conflict can complicate administration. The assistant kept her eyes on her folder, occasionally tapping a line with a pen as if we were discussing a simple transaction. The room was arranged to make me feel outnumbered without anyone raising their voice. That is how polite control works. No one shouts. They just build a table where your chair is smaller than everyone else's. Richard then referenced the amendment again as though it were already settled. He spoke as if my mother had made a clear choice and I was simply catching up. I pictured the folder on my laptop with the draft and the emails and the timestamps. I pictured my mother in hospice trying to keep her eyes open. I kept my face still. I asked one question. Can you show me the capacity assessment? The room paused for a beat that was too long to be casual. Richard glanced at the assistant. The assistant glanced at her folder as if she might find the document by wishing. The advisor cleared his throat and said those evaluations are not always required depending on circumstances. Richard nodded quickly. Your mom was lucid. He said it firmly as if tone could replace paperwork. I did not argue. I did not say the words undue influence. I did not say hospice. I simply watched them avoid the question. The assistant slid a different document forward. This is just for privacy, she said. Standard. It was labeled as a non-disclosure and non-interference agreement. It asked me to agree not to discuss trust matters with third parties and not to obstruct administration. It sounded reasonable on first glance. That is how these things are written. They are clean and vague and full of words that can later be used like traps. If I signed, I would be silencing myself with my own hand. If I refused, I would become the problem they could point at. Richard softened his voice. Emily, we want to keep the family private. He emphasized family, like it was a club I could be removed from at any moment. The advisor leaned forward with that professional empathy that always comes with a closing statement. This will prevent misunderstandings, he said. It will protect you, too. I looked at the page and then at the pen. My hand stayed on my lap. That was the escalation, not the document itself, but the expectation that I would agree to be blindfolded for my own comfort. In that moment, something small clicked in my mind. In the email chain, I had seen a name that belonged to a contact from my work, someone tied to compliance circles and risk oversight, not a friend, not someone I would casually call, but a familiar thread that told me this situation was reaching into spaces I understood better than Richard realized. I did not react. I did not let my eyes widen. I simply noted it again internally, like marking a line in a report. Richard took my silence as hesitation. He smiled. Just sign it, and we can all move forward. The assistant angled the paper closer. The advisor picked up the pen and held it out as if he were offering relief. I felt the old instinct to keep peace, the reflex people learn in controlling families, the one that says comply now and cry later. Then I remembered the folder on my laptop and the texts that asked me to keep quiet. I remembered that if I signed this, I would be agreeing that my questions were interference. I lifted my gaze and met Richard's eyes for a moment. His expression was calm, almost kind, but his eyes were fixed, waiting for submission. My voice stayed steady. I need time to review this. Richard's smile thinned. The advisor shifted in his seat. The assistant paused mid-motion. The room temperature seemed to drop a degree. Richard set his hands on the table and said carefully that delays make things harder. That they were only trying to do what my mother wanted. That grief can make people suspicious. He was building the narrative again. I kept my face still. The value point was clear now. They wanted me to sign away my ability to question, to speak, to seek clarity. That was the actual fight. Not over money, not yet, but over permission to know the truth. I stood and gathered my bag. Richard did not stand immediately. He looked at me like I was choosing conflict. I paused by the door and let the quiet do its work. If you were in my seat, would you sign to keep peace or refuse and risk war? I stopped reacting and started working. That shift was quiet, but it mattered more than anything I had done so far. When people try to control you with manners, the only answer is discipline. I treated the situation like a compliance review, because that is what it was. I rebuilt the timeline from the ground up. I listed hospice intake dates and medication changes. I wrote down appointment schedules and visit logs. I aligned those dates with email timestamps and draft revisions. I compared signatures across documents and noted pressure patterns and spacing. I checked notary acknowledgments for time of day and location. I looked for gaps because gaps are where intent hides. I kept everything factual and boring. Facts do not argue back. I made a spreadsheet with columns for date, source, document, and note. I did not guess. I verified. When I needed confirmation, I asked only what I was allowed to ask. I called the hospice office and introduced myself as next of kin seeking general information. I did not request records. I asked about process. I asked how lucidity is typically noted and where those notes live. I asked whether assessments are common when legal documents are signed. The woman on the phone explained carefully what she could say and what she could not. I listened and took notes. I thanked her and ended the call. What mattered was not a quote. What mattered was understanding how the system expects capacity to be evaluated. That expectation did not match what I saw in the draft. I then drafted a single-line inquiry to the trustee firm handling the trust. One sentence. Can you confirm whether a capacity assessment and independent witness statement were obtained for the March amendment? I did not accuse. I did not attach files. I sent it and waited. While I waited, Maggie came over. She sat at my small kitchen table and wrapped her hands around a mug she did not drink from. She told me something she had not said before. Richard had your mom sign something in the kitchen while she thought it was insurance. Maggie said it without anger. She said it like a fact she had finally accepted. She described how the papers were placed in front of Laura and how Richard spoke softly and quickly. She described Laura asking if this was for coverage and Richard nodding and saying yes. Maggie said Laura was tired and wanted the conversation to end. I wrote it down exactly as Maggie said it. I did not add adjectives. I did not ask why she had not stopped it then. I understood why. The moment passed and people regret later. I told Maggie I was preparing for a public exposure and that I would not confront Richard directly again. She nodded. That was her permission and her warning. I continued documenting. I saved the inquiry email and created a folder labeled Trustee Correspondence. I backed it up. I added Maggie's statement with date and context. I kept my tone neutral even in my own notes. Neutral notes survive scrutiny. During that week, Richard grew restless. He began mentioning consolidations and efficiency again. He spoke about changing beneficiary designations on certain accounts and streamlining management. He framed it as administrative cleanup. I recognized it as pressure. Movement creates leverage. I logged each mention with date and witness. I did not respond to bait. When he asked if I had spoken to anyone, I said only I had someone review it. When he pressed, I added, they told me to document everything. I did not say who. I did not need to. Authority does not require names, it requires confidence. The trustee firm replied 2 days later with a careful message acknowledging my inquiry and stating that they would review records. The word review is small, but it changes the room. It meant the amendment was no longer invisible. I read the reply twice and then placed it in the folder. I did not celebrate. I prepared. I reviewed plain language explanations of why amendments are invalid when capacity is not established or when undue influence is present. I wrote a simple paragraph for myself, as if I were explaining it to someone older than me who did not want legal jargon. If a person cannot understand what they are signing, then the paper does not count. If someone pressures them while they are impaired, the paper does not count. Control gained that way does not last when examined. I practiced saying that calmly. Richard began moving faster. He mentioned potential transfers and temporary authority. He suggested that delays could cause losses. He said things might need to be done without consensus to protect value. That was the escalation. The threat was no longer implied. It was procedural. I responded by doing nothing visible. I did not argue. I did not warn him. I let the system catch up. I organized my files into a clean packet with a cover sheet and index. I prepared questions instead of accusations. I chose timing instead of confrontation. I told Maggie to be ready, but quiet. I scheduled my days so I would not be rushed. I slept when I could, and ate when I remembered. When Richard asked again whether I would sign anything, I said I was preparing for a formal discussion. He frowned but smiled. He said he hoped I was not making this bigger than it needed to be. I did not answer. The point was not size. The point was exposure. I was done trying to convince him. I was ready to let him explain himself in front of people who required documents instead of deference. The meeting was not a courtroom, and that was the point. Courtrooms invite performance. This was a mediation session at the trustee office, bright and neutral, and designed to make people behave. The building was in Manhattan, a few blocks from places tourists take photos, which felt almost insulting. My mother died, and now her money was being discussed in a conference room with a glass pitcher of water and a bowl of mints. The trustee had asked for a family meeting formal but not dramatic. That language mattered. It told Richard he could not control the room, and it told me I would not be dismissed as a child. I arrived early with Maggie. We sat side by side, not touching, both of us facing forward like we were at a dentist waiting room. I had a thin folder and a laptop. No thick binders, no theatrics. I wore a simple dark blazer because I did not want clothing to become a signal. I wanted my work to be the signal. When Richard walked in, he looked exactly like a man who believed the world owed him sympathy. He shook hands with everyone as if he was the host, not the subject. His voice was low and careful, the tone people use at memorials. He thanked the trustee for bringing us together. He mentioned how hard the last month had been. He said Laura was his life. He said he was trying to honor her wishes. He did not look at me when he said wishes. He looked at the trustee, at the assistant, at the framed certificate on the wall, anywhere but me. If you have ever watched someone try to control the narrative, you know the method. He spoke as if he had already won, and was simply asking the room to help me accept it. The trustee began with a calm introduction, describing the purpose of the session. Review concerns about the March amendment, clarify documentation, determine next steps. No raised voice. No drama, just procedure. Richard nodded with a face that said, "Of course," because he assumed procedure belonged to him. Then the trustee asked me to speak. I did not start with feelings. I did not start with my mother. I started with a timeline. I slid one sheet forward. On it were dates and short labels. Hospice intake, medication adjustment, draft created, draft revised, email sent, notary acknowledgement date. I said quietly, I am requesting confirmation that capacity was assessed and that an independent witness statement exists for the execution of the amendment. I then opened my laptop and displayed a brief email chain, printed and also visible on screen. Nothing highlighted, nothing underlined. Just the subject lines and timestamps. Re-execution options, witness availability. The air in the room changed, and it was immediate. People who work with documents recognize patterns. They do not need a speech. They need to see structure. Richard began to shift in his chair, the first crack in the performance. He smiled at me in a way that was supposed to be warm and corrective. "Emily, sweetheart, this is technical," he said. "Your mom trusted me to handle it." He turned to the trustee as if I was a nuisance. The trustee did not mirror him. The trustee leaned forward slightly, eyes on the paper, and asked a single question that landed like a gavel without sounding like one. "Where is the independent witness statement?" Richard blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He laughed once softly, as if the question was silly. It was not a laugh of joy. It was a laugh of delay. He said he believed everything was properly executed. He said the attorney office handled those details. He said Laura was clear. He said he would have to check. The trustee waited. Silence is an instrument in rooms like that. It forces truth to show itself. Richard tried again, shifting blame politely. "I do not have every file in front of me," he said. "We have been grieving." He said that word as if it should end all questions. The trustee did not move. The trustee asked again the same question in slightly different words. "Do you have documentation of an independent witness and any capacity assessment associated with the execution?" Richard looked at the assistant as if someone might rescue him with a binder. No one did. He looked at me then, finally, with a flash of irritation that slipped through his mourning mask. It was quick, but everyone saw it. His face said, "How dare you make me answer?" That was the public humiliation. Not because someone shouted at him, but because he could not produce what he claimed existed, and he could not do it in front of professionals who treat missing paperwork as a warning sign. Maggie spoke once, and only once. Her voice was steady, almost bored, which made it sharper. "Laura would have never done this awake. She did not add more. She did not cry. She did not accuse. She just placed that sentence in the room and let it sit there like a weight." Richard inhaled sharply, then leaned forward with a tone that tried to sound reasonable. "Maggie has always had an issue with me," he said. "She is emotional." That word again, emotional. The favorite word of people who want to keep power. The trustee did not look at Maggie. The trustee looked at Richard and said they would not evaluate personalities, only documentation. Then the trustee asked me if I had any further materials. I did not. I had already given them enough to ask the right question. That is the difference between fighting and correcting. I looked at Richard and said one sentence slow enough to be clear. "I am not here to fight. I am here to correct the record." His jaw tightened. He started talking faster, trying to regain control. He mentioned private family matters. He mentioned reputation. He suggested we handle this quietly. The trustee raised a hand slightly, not rude, just firm, and said they would be suspending the amendment pending review. It was one line delivered calmly, and it felt like oxygen returning to my lungs. I did not smile. I simply nodded, as if this was the only logical outcome. Then the trustee turned to me, and the tone changed in a way I could feel. "Ms. Bennett, thank you for being thorough." Richard flinched at my last name like it was a door closing. That respect was my seed for what came later, but in that moment, it served one purpose. It showed the room I was not a confused kid. I was the person who had done the work. Richard lost control in small ways after that. He interrupted. He corrected people unnecessarily. He spoke over the assistant. He tried to reframe the meeting as a misunderstanding. Each attempt made him look less stable. The trustee ended the session with clear next steps. Records would be reviewed. Temporary actions would be limited. Communication would go through the office. Richard stood as if he was still the host, but his smile was thin, and his hands shook when he buttoned his coat. As we walked out, he tried to catch my arm. I stepped aside without looking at him. If you are watching and thinking this feels familiar, you are not alone. Richard called late enough that the city had settled into its quieter rhythm when sirens were farther apart, and voices dropped on the sidewalk below my window. The screen lit up with his name, and I let it ring once longer than necessary, not to punish him, but to steady myself. When I answered, he did not waste time. "Let us not destroy the family over paperwork," he said. His voice was low and careful, the same tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while moving the line. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I said one sentence and let it land. And, "You tried to destroy me quietly." There was a pause on the line that told me the meeting had finally reached him. He tried another approach immediately, as if flipping pages in a script. "I am still your stepfather," he said. Then softer, "Your mom would hate this." He leaned on her name like a shield. I stayed silent. Silence has weight when you use it deliberately. He filled it with a sigh, and then a plea telling me he was under pressure, that the trustee had misunderstood that people were making things bigger than they needed to be. I responded with very little because very little was required. The facts had already spoken. Over the next days, the consequences arrived without spectacle. The trustee notified him that his authority was suspended pending review. Control was removed first, not ownership, because that is how systems unwind risk. He lost access to decision-making. He lost the ability to move assets or change designations. Communication rerouted through the office. He tried to call meetings and was told to submit questions in writing. Each procedural step took away a piece of the power he had assumed was permanent. The ripple moved outward. Word traveled quietly through the circles my mother had moved in. The church group that once treated him like a devoted widower stopped asking him to lead anything. The friends who used to nod along at dinners began asking neutral questions that felt like distance. Invitations slowed, conversations shortened. He tried to explain it away as grief fatigue, but people who understand paperwork understand patterns too. Then the housing issue surfaced, not as punishment, but as consequence. The house he lived in was maintained through trust funds tied to administrative authority. When that authority paused, so did the arrangement. He was given notice that occupancy terms would be reviewed. It was practical and impersonal. He would need to make other arrangements. He called again when that letter arrived. His voice was sharper now, stripped of softness. He asked how far I planned to take this. He asked if I wanted him homeless. I answered only that the process would decide. That answer infuriated him because it offered no handle. He shifted again, offering compromise. "We can settle this," he said. He suggested a lifetime stipend framed as support. He suggested a one-time settlement framed as closure. He used words like fairness and peace. The requests revealed what the speeches had hidden. This was not about honoring my mother. It was about preserving comfort. Each offer came with an implied expectation that I would step in to save him from the consequences of his own actions. I did not counter. I did not negotiate. I let the silence return after each proposal. When he accused me of cruelty, I reminded him of nothing. When he tried to bargain with memories, I did not engage. The escalation was visible now. A man who once controlled rooms with a smile was reduced to asking for allowances. That was the point of fracture. He did not stop calling. The messages grew shorter, then longer, then apologetic in tone if not in content. He apologized for misunderstandings, for timing, for stress. He never apologized for the act itself. That distinction mattered. He asked for help finding a temporary place to stay. He asked if I could speak to the trustee on his behalf. Each request was framed as a favor, as family duty. I declined without explanation. I used fewer words each time. When he accused me of enjoying this, I did not respond. Enjoyment had nothing to do with it. Control had been taken from him, and he could not accept that it would not be returned by persuasion. Near the end of the week, he left a voicemail that was quieter than the others. He said he did not understand why I was doing this. He said he had taken care of everything for years. He said I was making him look bad. I listened once and deleted it. The truth was simpler than his theories. He had reached the end of leverage. The system had moved past him. The trustee communicated directly with me now, asking clarifying questions, outlining timelines, setting expectations. I responded with documents and dates. I did not editorialize. The distance between what I did and what he said grew wider every day. When he called again, his voice cracked in a way that sounded rehearsed. He asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. I answered with a small truth and nothing more. Mom had a second set of instructions. I did not explain what they were. I did not need to. The sentence alone was enough to shift the ground beneath him. He went quiet. That was the sound of someone realizing the floor they stood on had always been temporary. The value of that moment was not revenge. It was clarity. He had no path forward that did not pass through consequences. His last messages tried to soften again, to appeal to shared history, to suggest time would smooth things over. Time only smooths what is already honest. He was out of options, and everyone involved could see it. The escalation ended not with a confrontation, but with a settling. Authority removed. Reputation diminished. Comfort interrupted. Requests unanswered. He had asked me not to make things bigger. He had already done that himself. The week after Richard said my mother would hate this, I learned how strange peace feels when you are not used to it. There was no celebration, no victorious music, no moment where I stood in the middle of my apartment and laughed at a man who tried to corner me. I just noticed small things. My shoulders sat lower. I could drink a cup of coffee without checking my phone every 30 seconds. I could look at a document without feeling my pulse in my throat. Grief returned in a quieter form, the kind that does not compete with adrenaline. It was the grief I should have been allowed to have from the beginning. The trustee office scheduled a final review call on a Tuesday morning in late May 2023. The timing felt almost insulting, like the world expected me to fit heartbreak into a calendar slot. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad because that is what I do when I am trying not to fall apart. Maggie sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a mug like she was holding heat on purpose. When the trustee joined, her voice was professional and calm. She confirmed what I already knew. The amendment would not move forward as written. The review had found enough indicators of undue influence and lack of proper safeguards that it could not be treated as valid. Richard was not only removed from administrative control, his request for any ongoing benefit tied to that control was denied pending additional determinations. The trustee paused, then said there was one more item in my mother's file, an item that had been sealed to be opened only if a specific condition was met. I felt my throat tighten because even after everything, part of me still expected the universe to ask for more. The trustee said my mother had left a letter of wishes separate from the trust language, but stored with it and a short video message intended for the trustee and for me. She explained that this was common in careful estate planning, not legally binding in the same way as the trust document, but powerful in guiding intent. She asked if I wanted to receive it now. I did not answer right away. I looked at Maggie, and she gave me a small nod that meant, yes, take what your mother left you. I told the trustee yes. The email arrived while we were still on the call. It included a scanned letter with my mother's handwriting and a video file link hosted through their secure portal. The trustee offered to end the call so we could have privacy. I thanked her, and we disconnected. For a moment the apartment was silent except for the refrigerator hum and the faint traffic outside. Maggie did not speak. She just slid the mug closer to me like she was giving me something steady to hold. I opened the letter first. My mother's handwriting was neat, the kind you develop when you have spent a lifetime making numbers behave. She did not start with drama. She started with love, the practical kind. She wrote that she knew how families could turn soft words into ropes. She wrote that she had watched Richard for years. She wrote that she had seen how he spoke to me, always polite, always dismissive, always ending with a sentence that put me back in my place. Then came the line that landed like a weight and a gift at the same time. If Richard tries to control it, it means he learned nothing. She wrote that she had built protections, not because she wanted conflict, but because she understood human behavior. She wrote that I was not fragile, just tired. She wrote that I deserved respect even when I did not demand it. She explained the condition clearly, as if she were writing to someone who needed the logic spelled out. If there was an attempt to alter the trust during a period of diminished capacity, or if there was undue influence, or if there was pressure disguised as care, then Richard would lose every benefit she had ever intended him to have. Not just control, everything. She wrote that she did not want a man rewarded for trying to silence her daughter with paperwork. My hands shook slightly, not from fear this time, but from the shock of being seen. I thought about the funeral, the lilies, his hand on my shoulder, the way he smiled at people while Maggie whispered her warning. My mother had known. She had been sick, yes, but she had not been blind. I opened the video next. The screen filled with my mother sitting in what looked like her own living room, wearing a cardigan and a calm expression that made my chest ache. She spoke in a steady voice, not long, not theatrical. She said she was sorry for leaving me to handle anything alone. She said she had tried to build a life where I would not have to fight for basic dignity. Then she looked straight into the camera and said the sentence that took the last of the doubt out of me. Emily, if you are watching this, it means someone tried to make you small. Do not explain yourself, just correct the record. I sat there and felt something loosen inside me. Not anger, not triumph, relief. In America, people do not steal with masks. They steal with paperwork. The cruelest families do not yell. They smile and call it concern. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman does is stop explaining. Maggie let the silence stay a little longer, then she finally spoke, her voice softer than I had heard it in weeks. "Now you can grieve safely," she said. I nodded because that was exactly it. The fight had never been about money in my chest. It had been about the right to mourn without being managed. I did not call Richard. I did not send a victory message. I let the trustee handle the consequences my mother had already defined. The peace that followed was not loud. It was clean. It was the first full breath I had taken since April. If this story touched something you have lived through, share a line in the comments. Your voice matters here.